So, often when we think of science and storytelling, we think of them as opposites. One objective and unyielding, the other emotional and often very dramatic. In this short session, I would like to discuss how storytelling can actually act as a bridge, not only between science and society, but between people and places, past, future, memory, collective memory, action, and the challenges that do exist in this approach. This is especially important in Mauritius, where histories of slavery, indentured labor, colonial legacy complicate how we think about land, heritage, and nature. Yet we do live in a moment where ecological crisis is a reality. It does demand connection, and this connection at this point does not help the whole process of environmental conservation. So to frame this overview, I invite all of us to think in the context of what stories do we recount and share about nature in Mauritius? Who gets to speak? Whose voice is heard? Who is expected to listen? Who is actually silent? And what is left unspoken? When elements are unspeakable or forgotten? What are the narratives that link our local society historically, culturally, and ecologically? So I'll just start like introducing this with a little anecdote of something that happened to me quite recently. So I went to historical site in Mauritius that is like very famous and everything, and we did the guided tour, and which was very interesting. She was like she had information and everything, and then towards the end there was this lady this tourist foreigner, so basically, who asked the question, were slaves actually involved in the creation and maintenance of this space? And the tour guide got so flustered, got so uncomfortable, and she's like, "No, no, no. We did not have slaves here because by that time we had like indentured laborers." And what was interesting was there was before any of us could reply, like as Mauritian, there was this other for like tourist who was like, "Yeah, but we've been this place, this other place, and I don't think indentured laborer was any better or happier than the slaves." And she really did not want to address the situation. There was that hesitation, there was that discomfort that she had there, and she wanted to be out of this narrative. She didn't want to talk about it. And um, this is not about a single guide or a single site. It's symptomatic of a much larger problem in Mauritius, the fragmentation of historical memory, and how it continues to shape how we talk about land, heritage, and as such, nature. We visit these historical sites, we actually hike through our very fragmented forests, we look at the views, but how often do we actually talk about those landscapes, um, like how they were made, who was displaced from where, and what were their realities, whose voices were edited out in the process? So But okay, so you might actually be wondering, why are we talking about colonization? Why am I bringing colonization in a conversation about science, nature, and storytelling? Here's why. Colonialism didn't just shape land and labor. It also shaped how knowledge was produced and whose knowledge counted. It decided which voices were recorded, whose experience was documented, and how landscapes were interpreted. Unfortunately, despite attempts to start the shift in ideologies and appropriation of knowledge, the same dynamics still seem to apply in a lot of conservation intervention and environmental science today, where dominant narratives often trace back to colonial categories in terms of which species are worth saving, whose use of land is destructive, what counts as valid ecological knowledge. If we don't address our colonial legacy, we risk reproducing it even in good faith. This is why it matters to understand and accept our colonial legacy, not to be like uncomfortable or ashamed of it, but to actually have an open space for it. Because when we're exploring ideas and understanding realities, it's easier to help unearth silence truth and by default speak about storytelling, but from a natural perspective as well, from a nature perspective as well. And so when we talk about, let's think of Mauritian history for a moment. Half a millennia ago, before European colonization, Mauritius was an uninhabited by human population. So for more than 400 years now, people quite literally shaped the island. So in conservation discourse, we still hear echoes of this blank slate narrative. Hence, this begs the question of whose island is it? Is it for the society, for our modern society, the native species that we are not part of, the scientists, the alien invasive species, and like, are all human, and right now, are all human and non-human voices being heard? Additionally, when we think of conservation in Mauritius, we often imagine it as a neutral, benevolent science, protecting what's natural, saving what's left, working towards a better world. But we often forget that the root of conservation in Mauritius and in many other colonized countries are deeply entangled within the colonial system of land control. In the 18th and 19th century, land was not protected for its own sake. It was protected for economic and administrative purposes to regulate timber, water sources, plantation boundaries. Forests were classified, fenced, and managed through bureaucratic logics, often without considering the knowledge, needs, and presence of local people. Even today, many protected areas mirror that structure. Forests and seas are zoned to be protected from the people, access is regulated, and policies tend to be protectionist rather than inclusive in approach. Communities, especially those living nearby, are rarely consulted and included. This is what some scholars refer to as fortress conservation, a model that views nature as something to be separate from people, as if human presence is inherently a threat. I came across this concept during my master's while doing political ecology, and it really made me think about the implication in how we as people reappropriate our nature. This model reflects a colonial legacy. It assumes that people, especially poor, um, like rural people, community, radicalized community or racialized community don't belong in nature and can't be trusted to care for it. This approach has roots in Western ideologies of conservation, which I argue needs to be reviewed if we are to shift towards a more inclusive environmental protection. And belonging is not just about ancestry or ownership. It is about relationship. And stories are how we build that relationship. They remind us that nature is not a museum. Memory does matter. And even if you're not born in a forest or you're not born near it, you can learn to take care of it. Storytelling also makes conservation more emotionally accessible. It shifts the narrative from regulation to care, from control to connection. And in a country like Mauritius, where very few people feel a cultural or ancestral claim to the land, um, reclaiming this space in terms of storytelling is very essential because without belonging, there can be no stewardship. And storytelling helps shape this belonging. But now we come to another issue when we're speaking about that. How do you story what you never knew? In Mauritius, like I said, like 500 years ago, we weren't in Mauritius. So one of the more subtle and but profound challenges in Mauritius is this. We're asked to care about species we've never seen. So the dodo, the giant tortoise, the Mauritian owl, native land snails, many of them are actually gone. And even the flying fox, even despite being alive, has been subject to state sanctioned culls and public vilification, despite being ecologically vital. So how do we story, recount, or even mourn something that we never touched, we never saw, never shared a space with? In Mauritius, we often lack this emotional connection to environmental loss. Colonization, displacement, rapid development all have created a fractured relationship between people and biodiversity. This is where storytelling becomes really essential because stories give form to absence. They allow us to imagine what was and what could still be. They help us build empathetic bridges between past, present, and the non-human lives. So, I'm putting here a quote from anthropologists Deborah Budrose and Tom Van Joran. They are some of my favorite thinkers in the environmental humanities because they speak of what we call ecological mourning, a form of grief that arises not from direct personal loss, but from deep ethical awareness that something irreplaceable has been taken from a shared world, from a shared space. Mourning is not weakness, it's relationship. It means we allow ourselves to care, to feel, even retrospectively about what is gone, and in doing so, recommit to protect what remains. In Mauritius, we often lack this emotional connection to environmental loss. Colonization, displacement, again, rapid development have created this fractured relationship between people and biodiversity. And we have not mourned for our lost nature because we do not know what to mourn to start with. We have lost species that we cannot or are unable to connect with. And yet, the extinction is at the forefront of the current environmental discourse without any functional or cultural understanding of our existing relationship with nature. So, just to give an example of what I mean about mourning and understanding loss, I'll take first the Mauritius kestrel in Mauritius. This is a success story. In Mauritius, the Mauritius kestrel, our official national bird, has been so the result of its conservation success was through intensive conservation, captive breeding, habitat protection, supplementary feeding, and it bounced back from 4 known individuals in the 1970s to around 300 individuals today. But from a scientific perspective, this is a textbook success. What about socially? The kestrel remains largely absent from the public imagination, except in like some painting here and there that I do come across. But few Mauritians know its story, let alone feel emotionally connected to it. It lives on in posters and research papers, but not in folklore, not in songs, not in shared memory. Now let's contrast this with the vulture crisis in India. So, birds of prey that feed on carrion, um, like vultures are very important in India because a lot of Indians have cattle and they do not eat meat. They do not eat beef. So, when the cattle gets old and dies, what they usually did traditionally was put the cattle outside and the vultures would feed on. And that was the way of like, it was basically a circle of life. And before 1990s, the vulture population in India was around 50 million. And then between the 1990s and early 2000, it plummeted by more than like almost 97% of its population. And they didn't know what was happening. It's only in the later years with studies that they found out that it was diclofenac. So diclofenac is an anti-inflammatory that they were feeding to cattle. And this was bioaccumulating in the cattle. And when they died, the vultures were feeding on it. But the birds cannot handle this amount of toxicity, and it was killing them, and it dwindled the population like massive. But this wasn't just a loss of biodiversity in India. Why it was true that it was about like so there was nothing to feed on the cattle, there was increased diseases and people died. It was also a cultural and spiritual rupture. What I mean by that is in a lot of Indian tradition and also in Tibet, Bhutan, Mongolia, there are some communities that actually perform what we call sky burials. Sky burials involves the process of instead of having the human dead, so instead of cremating or burying them in the earth, they would actually put them outside And it's a way of actually celebrating life. They would put them outside, and then the vultures would come and feed on the body because a lot of cultures believe that once the soul leaves the body, it is just a shell. So it is a celebration of life, and ecocentrism, whereby intrinsic value is placed on all of nature, not just on the usefulness that it has for humans. This contrasts a bit with anthropocentrism, which puts people above everything. So in this case, it demonstrates the being one with nature and the fact that when you die, you still become part of the ecosystem. You're still being food for that ecosystem, basically the circle of life. And this cultural grief did translate in national outcries, policy change, and conservation funding. And that was the tradition. And one thing that I found also fascinating is that they also have myths surrounding these vultures. So in the Ramayana, which is Hindu scripture, they have the story of Jatayu, the king of vultures. And they have this whole thing around where he was the one to actually, he was one of the first to protect goddess incarnation, Sita, during her abduction. This is like rooted in it's like it gives credence to non-human entities. So it's rooted in myth, but it's also viewed as more than legend. It's traditional ecological knowledge where animals are not just resources, but are also guardians for people and nature at the same time. In post-colonial Mauritius, however, we so far do not have these kind of written stories about nature, about native nature, I should say, that remind us that loss is not just biological, it's also cultural. So what is the difference? Both stories involve deep ecological change, but only one was supported by shared emotional and cultural narrative. The Kestrel story remains isolated, celebrated in scientific circle, but unrooted in everyday life. The vulture story, on the other hand, mobilized public empathy, policy reform, and even spiritual reflection. This comparison highlights a critical insight. Scientific success is not enough. Conservation needs cultural meaning to be successful in the long term. While conservation success stories focus on numbers and survival, it overlooks that cultural, emotional, and ethical resonance that make it more accessible to people. And I will now take a local case in Mauritius. So in Mauritius, we have the flying fox, which I mentioned a few times already, and they are a native species. They existed way before we came to the island. So prior to human settlement, so in terms of rights, they have more rights of access to resources than we do. But despite that, they are actually viewed as pests, and people don't have any much qualms about harming them if they're in the backyard and they're eating your litchis. And most of the activism effort during the backculling that happened in the previous years was the result of efforts made from scientists, not as much from the layperson. In contrast, the long-tailed macaque, which is an alien species that was introduced at the time of human settlement. So, and there is data that shows that they do cause damage to native fauna and flora. Yet there is a lot of sympathy for this species, with people actually feeding them when they come in the backyard, being so like, sympathetic to their cause. And I think on Saturday there was a march to stop some like experimentation, which is another issue in itself, but they do have sympathy for these creatures and for these species. And and most of the response, because scientists view them as a problem for for the native ecosystem, but people view them as something that needs to be protected because they have a right to live, but the bat doesn't. So why is that actually the case? Well, because for the monkeys, there is the emotional connection, the generational memory, cultural and religious underpinnings. And there's because, one of a lot of comments I come across on social media when it involves this is like you have a shrine to Hanuman, which is a god in like Indian like religion and myth, but you're still killing monkeys. So you shouldn't do that. How dare you? You're not thinking you're going to, you're going to pay and everything. And then on the other hand, when you talk about the bat, it's that got the negative connotation. Most people can't make the difference between vampire bat that we don't even have in Mauritius, the flying fox, the tombats that we do have in Mauritius. I had stories whereby people thought the tombats were like babies of the flying fox. They are loud, they are nocturnal, so there is that fear that comes in when people think of the night. There is no historical connection that people can relate to. And there is no faith-based narrative to rely on to build a story around. And so then why is it that data has failed the bat, like I mentioned previously? Because science tells us what's happening. It gives us raw data. It gives us data, interpreted data, like the loss of forest cover, the drop in biodiversity, the rise in temperature. But on its own, data doesn't always or almost never moves people. It can be abstract, overwhelming, and often emotionally distant. And memory, by contrast, tells us how it feels. It roots the numbers in lived experience, in what has changed, what is missed, and what we still hope for. In Mauritius, this gap is often visible. Scientific reports circulate, and scientists are adamant about their numbers often, and the fact should be absolute. But communities often feel alienated, either because the language is inaccessible or because the stories that shape their own understanding of land are nowhere in the picture. This is where the idea of transdisciplinary approaches to ideologies and concepts becomes crucial. It's not just about adding different disciplines together. It's about recognizing that knowledge is plural and that elders, artists, children, farmers, fishers, they all know something worth listening to. The question is, can science listen? Can it hold spaces for other ways of knowing, for metaphors, dreams, memories, rituals? Can it acknowledge that feelings are also data, even if not coded in a way that scientists can analyze and discuss, that mourning, joy, and memory are valid forms of insight. Storytelling offers a bridge to this. It doesn't dilute science, it grounds it. It anchors facts in context. It helps build public trust, emotional resonance, and cultural relevance. And so, how do we make science resonate beyond the lab or report? Um, because we need to engage more than just the mind. Storytelling helps science reach the heart and ultimately drive action as it moves people emotionally and compels action. So we can use it strategically by starting with lived experience before layering the data. People connect to people first, ground stories in place. So, especially for island communities like Mauritius, where identity and ecology are intertwined, there is no size fit all. There are different communities around the island, and they each have different individualities and collective and otherwise that need to be understood and respected. Invite co-creation, so weave stories with people, not about them, and first foster ownership and trust and frame action within emotion like sadness, hope, loss, pride. We relate better to these than to numbers, however accurate they can be. In post-colonial spaces like Mauritius, where trust in institutions can be low and a disconnect how local nature exists, storytelling should not just explain science, it should build relationship and create meaning. When storytelling is approached in this way, science no longer floats above society like this God persona um, that we have to fear. It lands, it roots, and it gives space to grow. And but there are pitfalls that we need to avoid despite our best intention, because it can Um, Science communication carries echoes of colonial thinking that we do need to reflect on. And there are some common mistakes that happen, and they reproduce the same dynamics that we seek or we think needs to be dismantled. It includes speaking to impress, but avoid speaking to impress, because we want connection. So don't use jargon or overload facts that alienate audiences instead of engaging with them. Scientists have this, many scientists have this tendency of saying we are right because we have the numbers. But also we need to factor in people's reality. And this is often forgotten. Telling without listening. So storytelling should be reciprocal, not a one-way transmission. Ignoring power and context, because stories that overlook history, inequality, or lived realities come across as tone deaf. Assuming one story fits all, Mauritius is not one homogeneous audience, and we need to be aware that regional, generational, and cultural nuances matter. And we need to be aware that we shouldn't be erasing people's emotions. We shouldn't, not just people, but human and non-human actors both, because presenting science as detached does weaken its impact. People are moved by feelings. Again, like I said, not figures alone. In post-colonial context, how we tell stories matter as much as what we say. The most powerful environmental narrative will be those that are self-aware, historically grounded, and emotionally open, inviting others into a shared future, not just a rehearsed past. So we are a people without ancient roots in this island, in this land, but this doesn't mean we don't belong. Our belonging can be chosen, built, and told. In a place shaped by this kind of rupture of colonization, storytelling is not a luxury. It's a tool for healing, for bridging, for remembering differently. It helps us ask better questions of what does it mean to care for the land you did not inherit? How do we mourn what we never knew? And how do we tell environmental stories that carry not just science, but feelings, history, and hope? Postcolonial storytelling invites us to hold the broken and the possible in the same breath, to center not just the facts, but also the relationship, not just the knowledge, but be humble about what we do not understand. If we are to restore our ecosystem, we must also restore our narrative. Let's tell stories that root us. Let's tell stories that carry weight of the past and help promote coexistence for a better future.